Good afternoon and welcome to today's Women in Science Network special event on this winter solstice. And looking out my window, it really is a glorious winter's day here in Melbourne. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who've been custodians of this land for thousands of years. And I acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to other Indigenous people who may be joining us today. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all of the lands from wherever you are joining us today. So thank you for joining us, because I'm very excited about today's event. It's on a topic that is very close to my heart, which is effective science communication. My name is Jen Martin and I founded and lead the university's science communication training program. And I also do a lot of my own science communication in writing and on radio. And I couldn't be more delighted to be joined by our three guests today. If you would like to join me, we have Linda Ashcroft, Kath Healy and Kylie Quinn. And I have a whole lot of questions that I would like to ask these amazing women in science, but please also put any questions that you have into the Q&A and I'll make sure I leave some time at the end to get to as many of these as I possibly can. Now, rather than me waxing lyrical about how wonderful my three guests are today, and trust me, I could talk for ages about each of them. I'm very fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with each of them in different situations. But instead, I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves to you. What do they do? Why are they here today? So who shall I ask to go first? I think looking at my camera, Kylie, you are in the hot seat. So welcome, Kylie. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So my name is Dr. Kylie Quinn. I'm an immunologist by trade, so I study the immune system, how it works, and I got started during my PhD with developing vaccines for tuberculosis. After my PhD, I headed off to the US where I worked at the National Institutes of Health, which is where Tony Fauci heads up. For a scientist, it's like being a kid in a candy store, all the coolest stuff. And I was working there on vaccines for HIV. So I was working on adenoviral vaccines, which have been in the news a lot, and working on some what we call adjuvants. So one of the components for the Novavax vaccine is something called Matrix M. So then I moved back to Australia. I decided to take a slightly different tack and start to focus my research on understanding how aging impacts on our immune system. And so in 2019, I started my own research group at RMIT, so where I'm a Vice Chancellor's Research Fellow, and it's the Aging and Immunotherapies Research Group. So I'm looking at how aging impacts on vaccines and immune-based therapies that we're developing for cancer. And then 2020 happened. And like many of us, I was sent home from work in March and I thought, how can I best use my time? You know, I felt like I had this knowledge about vaccines and how they work, and particularly how they work for older people. So I reached out to our media and comms team, and that has led to a roller coaster and a very quick learning curve in how to communicate to the public about vaccines. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you, Kylie. And I feel like we may well come back to that roller coaster and discuss it in a little bit more detail. So thank you for coming today. Lyndon, you are next on my screen. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It's the winter solstice and it's also Show Your Stripes Day, which is racing around Twitter at the moment, showing the annual temperature variations. These ones are for Australia from 1901 up to 2020. So I am a lecturer in climate science and science communication at the University of Melbourne. I'm a climate scientist by training. I did my PhD looking at the historical climate of Australia from European invasion up to the present day, which is a really nice mix of science. So I look at weather observations and try to tease out the climate signal from the non-climate signal, which is due to people moving instruments or people building houses next to instruments, or, you know, people reading things wrong. So it's a really nice mix for me of telling stories and finding the people side, the human aspect of the science. And that's kind of something that has been a thread throughout my career. I did a science degree, but I also did some science communication and literature research study. When I finished my PhD, I worked for an environmental non-for-profit organisation, which again was a mixture of science and stories. And then I went overseas and did a postdoc. And I came back after that and worked at the Bureau of Meteorology for a couple of years, again, looking at the climate of our country and how that is changing, doing the really interesting statistical analysis, but then also putting that information together to share not only with the public, but with politicians as well. That was my dream job, I thought. And then a couple of years ago, there was a job advertised at Melbourne University working in science communication. And I've always believed that the best people to talk about science are the people who are doing the research. These are the people with the authenticity and the credibility. And there's so much science that is lost because people are doing it, but they don't know how to share it, or they're getting stuck with words, or they're getting caught up in making sure that their slides adhere to some kind of university template. So I came to the University of Melbourne instead, and now I teach undergraduate students weather and climate science, which I love. And then I also work with Jenny teaching graduate students mainly how to share their work better so their science can change the world.
Thank you, Lyndon. And how lucky was I the day I managed to snag you onto my team. I tell you what, I am one lucky person. All right. And Kath, finally to you. We would love to hear about your background.
Absolutely. Well, my background is very different in that I have never worked as a scientist, and I don't identify as a scientist, but I'm quite nerdy and sciencey. So, and my background was, I did a science degree in zoology and ecology, but I also did an arts degree in drama. So there you go. That's basically me, drama and zoology all squished together. Then I kind of was like, what do I be? Learn how to speak. What will I want to do when I grow up? And I became a fairy. I did kids theatre. Then I kind of fell into education. I became a primary school teacher, which I really didn't like. A bit to that. And then I really fell into science communication by going for a job at CSIRO. So that was 16 years ago, and I've been doing science comms ever since. I found my niche, I found my home, which is combining my love of science and my love of communicating. And I've worked for CSIRO, I've done lots of freelance writing. Most recently, I worked at EPA Victoria for 6 years, which was an amazing place to work. Also worked in publishing, and I've actually gone back to publishing. So I'm doing science and STEM publishing, focusing on high school kids at the moment. So I've done pretty much almost, not every kind of job, but a lot of different jobs under that umbrella of science comms, and I'm very passionate about what I do, and I love it.
Kath, that's exactly why I want you here, because you're so different and you've done so many different things. And another little shout out here for science and arts degree, because I also am very proud of my arts degree. So Kath, let's stick with you then for a second. The first question I have, I would like to actually ask each of you, and some of you sort of already touched on this answer a little bit, but if you had to sum it up in just a couple of sentences, what would you say is your answer to why do you go out of your way to communicate about science? I mean, on one level, you're paid to do it. Yes, some of you more than others, but I guess more philosophically, everyone is really busy. Why do you believe deeply that communicating about science is an important thing to do?
I love that question so much. It's because, and this might sound a bit cheesy, but I honestly think that if you pare away everything that's important in life, it usually comes back to science in some way or the other. And I think in more recent years, the thing that's really crystallised why I think my job's so important is related to climate change in particular. And I think it's the problem facing us all. And science communication is such, it basically, in order to find solutions and to live in this future that's really in the present, we need people to understand climate change and take action on climate change. And the biggest way to do that is to communicate in lots of varied and different ways really effectively. So I think for me, it's really about life and death. If I want to be a bit dramatic about it, the drama side comes out. It's life and death, science comms. It's so important, but it really is.
You're speaking my language, Kath.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lyndon, I'm guessing that resonated with you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Kath. I mean, for me, and I've always said this ever since I was young, I was like, science is everywhere, and weather and climate science as well. There's nothing that I can think of that climate change isn't going to touch or isn't already touching. And so I feel like not just the science communication that we think of almost one to many, but the conversations are the things that need to be happening more and more. And for me, I think talking about science and sharing science and having conversations about science is not only crucial for us as a planet to act, but also as scientists, we kind of, I think, have a duty to talk to more people about our science, to inform our own science. You know, this is happening more and more. People, blue sky science and big picture thinking is somewhat sadly getting smaller and smaller pieces of the pie when it comes to research. But in the climate space in particular, you know, there's conversations happening with the people and the industries and the organizations who are really going to be impacted. And the science that's done needs to kind of be informed by that. It can't just be, oh, hi, we're at uni, we're going to tell you what to do. Like, it needs to be a two-way conversation. And I think that is something that scientists just generally aren't really taught or aren't educated. We just assume that we're going to pick that up, and some people do, but a lot of people don't. And so I think that is why it's so crucial. Maybe that's selfish as a scientist, be like, actually I want to talk to people so I know how to do my research better as well, but I think that is really important.
I think there are other benefits, Lyndon. I don't think it's really being selfish. Kylie, I'm sure a lot of that resonates with you too, but I think particularly some of the conversations that you and I have had, it really strikes me. You know, you are incredibly busy. You have a lot of research on your plate. You have a lot of leadership on your plate. And yet you said to us earlier, oh, I realized that, you know, I got sent home and I realized that I had some valuable knowledge to share. So I decided to jump on this roller coaster. Can you tell us more about that? Because you could have easily just kept your head down and done your work, right? No one told you you have to become a public figure in a COVID, you know, in a global pandemic and share your knowledge publicly. You could have ducked under that. So tell us your thinking.
Yeah, so look, for my PhD, my training was in a philanthropically funded organisation. So part of my training is that I am accountable to the public. And part of my training was also, I view scientific knowledge as a cyclical process. So we start off, we try and identify a knowledge gap or an area of need. And then you try and address that with your science. You try and address that need. You try and build new knowledge that can help people. And then to plug that new knowledge back into that body of knowledge that we all collectively have as human beings, you have to communicate it in some way. And so often, you know, we communicate to our peers. But if we don't communicate to the public, it's a missed opportunity. Our job is to build the body of human knowledge, and that should be democratically available to everyone. And people should be able to use that in a really accessible way to help them understand the world around them. And whether that is helping them understand the world around them in the sense of climate change, or help them understand their own bodies in the sense of making good decisions about their healthcare. Knowledge is so important, and it should be available and accessible. And that is my part to play in that, is communicating what I know to the public to help them make sense of what's around them.
Hear, hear. I hope everyone at home is up, you know, kind of cheering and doing whatever they do to get excited. But so tell me a bit more then, Kylie, like you've said a few times, communicating to the public. Who are the audiences that you've actually had in mind in the last 15 months? Is it the people who, you know, are particularly hesitating around AstraZeneca? Is it the vaccine deniers who you know, have a whole lot of reasons that they're not going to consider vaccine at all? Is it like who have you had in mind in this work that you've been doing that you particularly want to communicate with?
Yeah, so I think a lot of my thinking around this was really influenced by, you know, I had to educate myself early on as to what my audience needed and who my audience was. So I really sought out experts in that vaccine communication space. So there's a woman called Julie Leask, who is fantastic. Another woman, Margie Danchin, Holly Seal. They've formed this group called the Collaboration on Social Sciences of Immunisation, which gives really great advice on how to identify your audience. and how to think about their different needs. And so you will have a huge spectrum of people out there, and some people are very resistant to any vaccination. And it will be very difficult to communicate with them. But there's a large group of people out there who just need more information. They may not have accessible information for themselves. They may have some uncertainties. They may have had bad experiences with healthcare in the past. And so it's thinking about that group of people and what they might need in terms of information. And obviously my research is really focused on older individuals, and so thinking about the needs of older individuals and really empowering older people to understand what this vaccine could mean for them, understand what our latest knowledge on this vaccine is. That's really important. But I also think you do, I guess I'm also really keen to communicate to a broader audience, because it's not just that older person that's making that decision by themselves. They're talking to their friends, they're talking to their family. And so you've got to make it accessible as you can to support that conversation as well. So it's tough. There's lots of audiences in there, but you've got to think about what will be most helpful to folks.
And I think that therein lies the rub, right? That's why science communication can be really hard to do well, because there's a lot of audiences and they're very diverse, and the particular messages that are going to be meaningful and relevant for them might be different.
Yeah.
Lyndon and Kathy, you both identified climate change, which, as you both said, is something that affects everybody and has been sort of, I guess, more of a chronic issue for us all rather than the acute situation we've been in with the pandemic. Would either of you be keen to share the audiences you have in mind when you're communicating?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in first, Lyndon, if you like. So for me, this is something I really learnt when I worked at EPA, was that there's this, the T word being trust. And I feel like, I think it's relevant in all science comms. I think it's particularly important when we're talking about vaccines with COVID, and I think it's also really pertinent when we're talking about climate change, because there is a distrust. And I'm really interested, something I learned about EPA was that, when I started, and I think it's probably still the case for some of our different audiences, that there's a lack of trust, I think, in government, and because EPA being part of government. And then I found that really challenging, because I was, prior to that, I worked for kind of CSIRO, and I never really encountered, you still can have issues with trust, but not to the same extent that you would for something so, environmental, and, you've got that weird balance between managing the economy. You can't just shut down all industry. So it's this kind of really between a rock and a hard place kind of that you're dealing with it as an environmental regulator. And I realised that I kind of learnt this really harsh lesson early on there, that it didn't matter how good your comms was, or even how often you communicated or used the right channels. If people didn't trust you, it was such a waste of time. So I feel like with climate change and with vaccines as well, that is such a key issue, with that thing of the building of trust. And that's, I think that's it's a long-term project in any kind of comms campaign or any kind of research, is that you need to have people on the journey with you, and from the beginning to the end. And I think the COVID one's been really interesting, because it's happening in a condensed time frame. Whereas I think with climate change, we've got, unfortunately, a really long journey to take people on. And so I think the building of trust is almost like an objective for people to then understand, or then take the action we want them to take. So I feel like that for me is the big lesson learned working in that space, was the T word, trust.
Yeah, that's so true, Kath. And I think that's something that is not always talked about when we talk about science communication training. We talk a lot about, okay, who are you talking to? Why are you talking to them? But we don't kind of ask that next who, about who is doing the talking. Are you the right person to be, sharing that message? And I think in some ways scientists have a little bit of a jump, because science is quite a trusted field, which I think is really good. But that's sort of a double-edged sword, because we also know that people trust other people. And if you're honest and open, then people are more likely to trust you. But if you're honest and open, then maybe you're seen as slightly less objective. And some people use that to say, well, then your science isn't reliable. You know what I mean? And thinking about the audiences that I speak to and that I think about when I'm doing science communication or talking about climate research, I reckon when I started my career, I was imagining the deniers. I was imagining people who weren't accepting the science of climate change. And if I'm honest, I still work largely with a demographic that you might think of as similarly aligned. I work with regional communities. I work with older male farmers kind of thing, which maybe you would think they would live in a similar space. But I haven't always found that to be the case. And I also think the situation that we're in now, there have been lots of studies done in Australia and overseas thinking about how the population divides itself into people who really, really care and are really alarmed and really want action versus the people who are actively dismissive. And it's a stubborn 9 or 10% of people who just don't accept the science and don't accept that we need to do anything. And that has been the same statistic for a long time. And to be honest, like, we don't have time to worry about those people. There's a lot of energy and time and money, a lot of money that has been wasted trying to change the minds of these people. And I mean, us versus them is not a great way to address any big problem, but I think in terms of maintaining your own stamina in fighting this or doing what you can in this challenge, that's the audience that you think, you know what, that's not my conversation. I'm going to work with the other people who maybe will talk to those people who will already have trust with those people. You don't trust the science, that's fine, that's your decision. I'm going to work with other people. And I think that's a more sustainable way, and that's a more sustainable audience that you might actually get some better conversations with as well.
Yeah, that just absolutely rings true with vaccines as well. It's, you know, it's the stubborn sort of 10% that just have a real reluctance, and that is fine. You know, those people, maybe they're not your audience, and so understanding who your audience is and building a long-term conversation is something I've learned over the experience of COVID. It's not necessarily one one point of communication, one experience of communication that you have to communicate everything in it. It's keeping your message consistent, developing a dialogue with your audience, and becoming that trusted person for reliable, accurate, accessible information has been a real revelation to me.
Kylie, can I just say, or can I ask, I've just on that point, because I think it's really interesting that you say that with AstraZeneca, you know, that the shift of the government, all of a sudden there's been a rapid change of messaging of recommendations rather, and then the accompanying messaging that we actually know, let's wait to go up to the after 60s, which I think has been really, it's interesting. It's kind of been unfortunate because I think it's fueled into people's fears a little bit. Yeah. But it's also, I find it from a, you know, if I kind of sit back from it, it's actually quite fascinating because you really think about, that's actually science in action. Because, you know, so it's, you know, we're in this situation, so it's, people don't normally see that. So we're having, because of COVID, I feel like things are having to happen in the open in a really, as we go away, because we've had to, because it's been this huge disaster. And yeah, I find that really, I feel like that's an unusual, I've never really witnessed that before to this extent.
Yeah, and I think, like you were saying, with vaccines, we sort of say, you know, a vaccine has to be safe, it has to be effective, it has to be accessible, and it has to be trusted to be a good vaccine. So trust is an essential part of that. And that transparency in the whole process of testing and the regulation and the monitoring, it's all such an important part of a vaccine rollout and building that trust. And we're in this situation where, look, I think the transparency of the advice that is coming from ATAGI, I've been so impressed, and they have adjusted their position as more information comes through. And I think it's challenging because that can for some people be really disorientating, because it feels like, you know, what's changing? Oh, you got it wrong. But this is the scientific process. It's the responsiveness to new information. And so I hope for some people it gives more insight into what the process of science actually is. and that we build consensus, we adjust to, well, react to new information as it comes through, and that gets us closer and closer to the ideal situation. So yeah, it's a real challenge because you need that transparency, and it's the process that we have to go through. But at the same time, I hope the public is gaining more of an appreciation that this is part of the process rather than, you know, adding to uncertainty.
So then thinking about...
Sorry, go on, Lyndon.
No, you can go. It's fine.
No. I was going to ask something slightly different, so you go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask about thinking about this idea of uncertainty, you know, and maybe Kath, you could help me as well, because we talk a lot about uncertainty when we talk about climate change and climate futures and future projections. And when the pandemic started and when we were all glued to the graphs every night, you know, watching the curve, there's lots of other curves that we're not watching that maybe we should be. I was thinking this is a masterclass in watching how people can communicate science and how people can connect with science if it's timely for them, if it's relevant for them, you know. But I thought that was done really well. But now watching this with the vaccine communication, do you feel that that T word is strengthening or is being weakened? I can't tell. I don't know. I'm just interested in your thoughts.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. Like if we kind of step back, because science has been in the news more really in the last few years than I can remember. Now, okay, I only have a certain number of years as an adult that I might have watched it, but like I was reflecting last night, my kids are so well versed on thinking about the pandemic and climate change, even though I grew up in an incredibly wonderful, scientifically literate family. At the age that my kids are now, I don't reckon I had my head around a whole lot of science. So I feel like science is everywhere in a way it hasn't been before. But yeah, where do we reckon the public is falling? Are they falling on the side of more mistrust or more trust? Because that's a really important thing for us to get our heads around as people who care about science communication.
Yeah, look, I think if the T word was transparency, I think people are getting lots of transparency. But I think if the T word is trust, I think there's so many different groups in our community at the moment, and I think some people are exhausted by the level of transparency and the level of information, and it's just too much to engage with. I think some people can engage with it, and it's okay. You know, they're dealing with the information as it comes through. There might be frustration, but you know, they can cope with the information. And then some others are diving very deep into the information and maybe a little bit unhealthy at times. And so it's really difficult to say. And you know, in terms of how the proportions within our population falls, I think time will tell. But I think it really is, you know, it's shining such a light on how we do science, and that, you know, with new information things change, and that it's all about consensus, and it's not about one person's opinion, it's about a group of people's opinion. And those sorts of things couldn't be more on display. So yeah, look, I hope ultimately that the transparency will give trust in the broader process.
You know, do you have thoughts on that, or Kath, in terms of the climate change situation we're in? Do you think trust is building or trust is waning in science and scientists?
I was thinking, just as you were speaking then, that trust from government is really clear in the COVID situation. That is maybe not present so much in the climate situation. I mean, we're seeing it in local governments and state governments that they're acting on climate science, but maybe not at the federal level yet. So I'll be interested to understand why that difference is occurring, why there's so much trust. I guess I remember going to a talk from a climate communication expert who said that it was after it was just after the Black Summer bushfires. Well, they get longer, don't they? Black Saturday now, it was a whole summer. The 2019-2020 Black Summer bushfires, we really thought this is the time. You know, look, 80% of Australia was affected by those fires that summer in one way or another. This is the time when action is going to happen and people are going to have to listen and, you know, trust the science and move. And then, of course, the pandemic happened and that sucked all the oxygen out of it. But our research in the US found that actually people were paying more attention to climate change than before over there, because they realized, oh, something that's happening far away from me can all of a sudden really affect me. And something that seemed really esoteric is now at my front door watching this pandemic. So climate change could be a similar thing. And I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm wondering whether this example of how we can trust the scientists and things, I mean, Australia's done really well, whether that will translate. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I look forward to finding out.
You know what I think the challenge with that is, though, and this is, I don't want to make it too political because, you know, we don't want to go down that, you know, rabbit warren of stuff. But I think it is, you know, at the moment there, I mean, you do have the bit of, you know, you feel like you're in a colony sometimes, the way that we're behaving as a nation with our little colonies everywhere. But I think, you know, that there was a little bit of we're in this together. It's around the world, which is actually true for climate change too. But I think that sense isn't there yet. Like, I feel like it's a little bit, well, it's not affecting me today. So, you know, and I think the bushfires, you're 100% right, Lyndon, that it was devastating, but it felt like there was an awakening of discourse going on, you know, about climate change, and people who just go, oh, it's actually happening now. It's not something that's going to be my grandkids. It's now, and it's affecting me today. And I think that was really powerful. But I think it has been, yeah, understandably lost in the COVID conversations. But I do wonder whether it might be the next event that, you know, brings it back to the fore. And when people start to go, oh, it's affecting me again right now, that's when maybe people have to take that, you know, trust might, you hope it might go up. But I think, you know, with our federal government and their stance, it doesn't really, I mean, you know, they're not backing the science and they're not backing the scientists. So that, I mean, their conflict they create in that discussion, that public discussion, is so disruptive. You know, it's almost like
it sows seeds of distrust, doesn't it? In
does.
many ways. And with every year it's delayed, then you think, well, you're all smart people. Like, you wear suits every day. Like, maybe you just know something that I don't, you know, maybe there's, okay, fine, I trust you. We are very trusting in our government as a whole. So maybe, yeah, it just slows things down, doesn't it? Even though we can see now that as individuals and as small communities, you're right, we can pull together and we can act quickly. And if anything, the last 15 months might have shown us, right, well, we've done it, we can do it again, you know? So that's something to hope for.
I'm looking at the time and I feel like there's a million questions I want to ask, just following on from what's just been said. But two things. Firstly, thank you to people who've already put questions into the Q&A. We will come to them in a little bit. If you have other questions, please add them at any time. But my team here, I'm conscious that one of the things we promised to deliver out of this session was some advice and some tips about how to do science communication better. And I feel compelled that we need to start talking about some of that stuff. But it obviously flows very clearly from what we were just discussing. So reflecting on what we've seen in the last 15 months in the pandemic or over a longer time period with climate change, thinking about communication that you've seen done really well or I guess potentially really badly, what advice, you know, if we were to come up with a top 10 list of how scientists can do this better, what would go onto our list? Kylie, do you have some things you've seen done really well that we should all take heed of?
Yeah, look, in terms of things that I think have been done well, I think, look, I have been impressed and relieved and proud of my colleagues to see people stepping up. I think there's, you know, we can think about ourselves as scientists in our little, you know, labs and working away at our stuff and, you know, and not engage or be reluctant or cautious or, you know, think, am I the right person to engage on this topic that you're obviously an expert in? So I think, you know, it's been really great to see people step out there and have the discussion. And I think something that we've needed to do along the way is really help people with language. So I think that's something that can be really helpful when you're thinking about how to communicate on a particular topic. Just even think about the fundamentals, like, do people have the language and understand the language to communicate on this topic? If they don't understand the basic definitions even, or if it's really new information, can you help them with just the understanding the very basic language of a topic so that they can talk to their friends and family and become part of the conversation, and it becomes something that is important to them rather than something that's peripheral that they don't really get, that they can't engage in. So for me, that's been quite important, like giving people the basic definitions of what efficacy of a vaccine is. And now everyone's talking about efficacy, you know, just those sorts of things can be massive and give people license to join the conversation.
Okay, so it sounds like tip number one then is back yourself and back your knowledge and be willing to put yourself out there. And tip number two is to be really mindful of the language that is comfortable for you and your colleagues, but maybe anything but inclusive for your audience.
Well summarised, yeah.
Lyndon, what have you seen done well? What do we need to try and emulate when we communicate science?
I think the word conversation that Kylie said really stuck with me, and that's a word that I keep coming back to. You know, this idea of lecturing at people is something that, you know, scientists have talked about for a long time, and science communication researchers have talked about for a long time. If we just talk at people more and we just shove more knowledge at people, then everyone will get on board. But that's not true in any field, really, not just science. It's a conversation that needs to happen. So the communication that I've seen done well has always been two-way, you know, respecting somebody else's point of view, somebody else's experience, and listening to them, because that will show that you respect them, and then they'll be more likely to listen to you and to trust you. And I think there were a few other words that came to mind, moving from T words to C words. I think consistency is also important. Not always consistency in the message, because things change and science changes, but being consistently present and being consistently, it can be hard to do and can be draining to do in some ways, but being there to have those conversations, I think is really important. And the other communication that I've seen done really well, thinking about colleagues of mine who, just like you using that language again, Kylie, stepped up after Black Summer. I felt like a lot of people in the community just sort of said, myself included actually, was like, you know what, this is enough. This is enough. This can't go anymore. And a lot of people I've seen have stepped up, and they, for the first time, weren't afraid to show themselves honestly. You know, they look at me, I'm an expert in this field. I know a lot about this stuff, but also I'm really afraid now, and we really need to do something. And I think, to me, that was the most powerful type of communication I saw.
Yeah, just briefly, I think touching on Lyndon, communicating, but occasionally you can communicate your concern or your emotion on a topic. And, you know, you don't want to do it all the time, but it can be very impactful when you do it.
Yeah.
Well, Professor Sutton's been doing that beautifully, hasn't he? You think lately he's been like, you know, I mean, I'm a huge fan, I have to say. But I think he, you know, he talks with empathy, like the empathy, and he was kind of, you almost got teary the other day, and he said, you know, this dilemma of public health, it's, you know, and he was almost this tortured kind of soul. But I was like, oh, I mean, I didn't have to convince me, but he was just that.
The drama,
the drama that I like. Yes, that's why I come back to the drama. But he's just
Kath, Kath, is this where you pull out and show us that actually you've got a Brett pillow behind you? Or
no, I don't. Although I did look at them. I did look at them on Etsy. I have to admit, I didn't buy one. But he's a great communicator, I think.
Yeah, and I think what you're all really alluding to here is the A word, which we hear all the time, which is authenticity. And I think people shy away from this idea of authentic communication because it's become this buzzword that no one really knows what it means. And it's really easy to say, yeah, you just need to be more authentic. And people sit there going, well, I don't really know what you mean by that. But exactly what you've just all said, being a human. So being a scientist who has technical knowledge and expertise, but also being a human who's really frightened about what's going to happen for the next generation, who's really scared about how many more times we're going to go back in and out of lockdown, who's, you know, like sharing that, yes, I have my professional presence who has a lot of expertise to share with you, but I'm also a human being who can listen to you, respect your point of view, and meet you in this messy place of, we don't exactly know what's happening here and we don't know all the answers, but gee, we're really trying to work it out to the best of our ability. And I think that's something to take away, but it's scary, right? Like being a human in a public space means you are vulnerable, and being vulnerable is uncomfortable.
Yeah. And Jenny, I just want to add that that it can be really exhausting as well. And there are some days when you think, actually, that's not what I can do today. That's not what I'm up for today. Or people who have been working on things for a long time, you've had to harden your shell and harden your heart sometimes, and that can be a really tricky thing to do. So I think it's finding that balance between showing yourself and taking care of yourself. That's something that is increasingly becoming a conversation in itself, right? For scientists and lots of other people.
I think I was just going to say, sorry, just another thing that I think, one of my tips that when I've come down training scientists too on improving their science comm skills, and a big one I think is relevance. So I think, and again, I think it can be harder in those bigger kind of communication campaigns, but I think it is really important because, something that I certainly encountered EPA a lot was that, well, why should I care about that? So if you don't make it relevant to them, and that goes back to really knowing your audience, but really knowing your audience, not going, okay, general public, which is just, isn't actually an audience. I mean, it is, but it's all the audiences within that. And I think it's really understanding them and their fears, and then kind of hitting that right tone of going, well, what is it why do they need to know this? Why do they really actually asking that hard question? Because sometimes maybe that audience actually doesn't need to know this, or they only need to know this bit of it. So I think that's something I would drill a lot in the scientists that I've worked with, is that you really need to make sure that you're giving them the information that they need, or the information they're going to have to act on.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Kath. I don't know what tip number we're up to, but I'm sure we've had lots of tips now. But to me, that's something along the lines of make sure what you're sharing and what you're communicating is actually what your audience needs to hear, rather than what you want to say. Because sometimes they're really different things. You have messages that are important to you that you want to put out there, but it may actually be completely irrelevant for your audience. So
I think as well, like that relates a lot to the empathy factor. Like, meet your audience where they are. Think about where they are and what they need in that moment. And it's a form of kindness to your audience, of like saying, okay, this is what you need, I can provide that. For the vaccines, that's that's been one of the big lessons I've learned over the past year, is to really meet people where they are, give them the information they need at the time. You don't need to persuade them in any particular direction, but you need to keep the conversation going. So.
Yep. I have so many more questions that I want to ask you, but I'm going to be a very well-behaved moderator and not ask my questions, because we have, I don't know if you guys are looking, but there are some really great questions in the Q&A. So I'm just going to launch into some of them because I want to get through as many as we can. And apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, because they're all terrific questions. But I'd like to start with Lisa's question. Lisa, lovely to have you here with us. And Lisa has said, how do scientists communicate in a way that gives people the sense that they are being listened to? So we've just said, we need to listen, we need to listen. How do we actually get that across? I wonder, so this is back to Lisa's question, I wonder whether some reluctance to hear the science stems from scientists often being used to give expert opinion rather than to listen to and to respond to what the public are concerned about. I find social media particularly awful for this sense of being shouted at by a bunch of experts. So how do we get away from creating these platforms that are just putting stuff out there, yet still reach a wide audience? I think that's a really terrific question, Lisa. Who would like to have a go at that one? Kath, please.
So I can just talk about just using a case study example. So some work that I did, was really fortunate to be part of, was working on this big co-design project. So I love, it's one of those buzzwords you hear a lot, co-design. But I think, and this doesn't work for everything. I think it obviously depends on the research and on the science, but I think actually having scientists face-to-face meet people in the community or wherever it is that you need to communicate with, and taking that time to actually talk to them and listen to them. And I think some scientists, the idea of that sounds absolutely terrible, and they're just like, that puts them out of their comfort zone a lot of the time. But in my experience, scientists do it brilliantly well. You kind of, and they are the best people to talk directly to their audience. And I think it can be quite resource intensive, but when you do it, the journey then that you go on and the conversations that you have are so rich and so valued, and you can do quite amazing things. And I think that can even extend to co-design in terms of the actual comms itself, actually getting we'll go, well, you know, what are your concerns? Well, can you help? How do you think is the best way for me to talk to your community? And can you help me actually write this? You know, actually taking their expertise and not doing like a lip service or a tick the box, like really genuinely engaging with them. And that's some of the most amazing, powerful comms you can do. You know, if you take that journey, but it's not an easy thing to do. But when it's done and done well, so it's amazing.
Yeah, great suggestion, Kath. And I think where that is a possibility, without question, that's something that should always be looked into. Lyndon and Kylie, I'm sure you would agree with that, but do we have any suggestions for Lisa in situations where that sort of co-creation is not possible?
I was just thinking about the social media situation, and yes, I really hear what you're saying about the being shouted at. You know, I spend a lot of time on Twitter, as a lot of scientists probably do, particularly when they're working from home and maybe not being so productive. And from a learning point of view, that's great. I get to hear about new papers. I get to see conversations between experts in my field, you know, thrashing around new ideas, and that's really great. But it does sometimes feel like just people, you know, yelling or bragging about their things. And so I'm wondering now whether Twitter's actually not the best place to have those kinds of conversations, where there might be other forms of social media that again requires input from you to be part of as a scientist, to be part of the conversation and respond to questions and respond to comments, and to do your shouting or to do your writing in a way that encourages those conversations. I just think maybe there are a different range of platforms, which is a bit of a cop-out to kind of blame the method, or like, you know, blame the tool rather than what you're saying. But I do think some of the social media techniques have become less of about a conversation, more of just showing off.
Yeah, I do think that there are other sort of avenues where you can interact with the public in, you know, informal ways, like through your professional society. Like, I'm part of the Australia and New Zealand Society for Immunology, and we have a program called the Day of Immunology, which just ran recently. And you know, there's always an effort to get into the public and talk to the public about immunology and what we do. There's often lab tours, that kind of thing, and you always have these conversations with the public on your way about, oh, what do you do? Oh, you know, and it informs you about your work, and you encounter people who have been affected by, if you study a particular health condition, they may have been affected either themselves directly or their family by that particular health condition. And so it informs your work. It also informs your motivation when you're engaging with people who are directly affected by these things. It feels so real, and it feels so motivating that you want to be able to help. And I think some fields do a really good job of that, like a lot of cancer research agencies are sort of requiring that individuals who are applying for funding actually engage with consumer advocates who can give advice on the research. And that, again, it's hugely motivating. It informs the research, and it's that whole thing of bi-directional kind of communication. You learn a lot about what is actually needed out there, and folks learn about what you're actually doing to help the community. So it's super important.
Yeah, absolutely, Kylie. I'm going to jump to quite a different question now, but it's one that's very close to my heart. So thank you, Natalie, for asking this. Natalie's question is, science communication is often called a soft skill. So it's often disregarded or minimised because of this connotation of it being soft or easy. This is despite science communication being the single most important skill I learned at university and the most useful skill outside of university in the workforce. So how can we change this perception? Yes. I promise I didn't.
How much money did Jenny pay you to ask that question, Natalie? No.
Nothing. But it's a really good point, right? I mean, I feel like it took me a long time for my calls that we needed to be teaching communication skills to science students to be heeded and to be taken seriously. But there's no time to waste, right? We've all just established there is no time to waste to have scientists communicating effectively. So how can we change that perception?
I feel like that perception is changing already. And I think it will continue to change as we have more female leaders in STEM. but maybe, I mean, we're a great communicator. Like if you're a good science communicator, then you can communicate your excellent skills, you know, whatever level of hardness someone else might perceive them to be. And I don't know, I kind of feel like if you're going for a job, or if you're, I mean, I don't know, as we know, I just feel like if you've got the science communication skills, you're more likely to get the job, and so you're more likely to do well. I think if there's any organization that doesn't value those skills, then they maybe don't really understand what they are valuing, and maybe they're not the place to work. That's not very helpful, actually. I'm just sort of a bit annoyed by the fact that that idea still exists. Maybe somebody else has got some better suggestions. I'm
Jason Major has piped in and said that we should be calling them transferable skills, which I think is a good call, Jason. But other thoughts, Kath or Kylie?
I think, and this is kind of, I guess, where I'm finding myself at this moment in my science comms career. But I've gone shifted back to education, because I was kind of like, where can I have the most impact? And I feel like part of it is an issue with scientific literacy. And so, you know, I've got this idea of, you know, think about most kids' exposure to science happens between the years 7 and 9, maybe 10 if you're lucky. So you've really got, they don't really do it at primary school. Most people don't do it in BCE or higher level. So you've only got this little window of opportunity where that's most people's experience of science. So I think the teaching of science and how science is taught really ties into how, you know, in terms of being just understanding what science is, which makes it easier as a communicator, but then actually teaching them that science communication as an explicit part of the curriculum, like actually teaching them a thing. So when a kid understands it, learns about science, physics, maths, they're also learning and science communication. You know, they kind of, and I think, you know, explaining that was a really good case study. So kids, when they learn science, they know what science communication is. So it's almost, that's kind of looking to the future, but I think that's part of the solution.
But are they science communication skills or just broader communication skills?
Well, they're both, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's more value or less divergence in the education system. Either, you know, we're all super proud of our arts and science degrees because they kind of feel like they're a rarity, because when you were in year 8 or 9, you're like, oh no, I'm not good at English, so I'll do maths and physics, or I'm not good at physics, so I'll just do, you know, I'll do English. Like, merging those two things together for a longer period of time is much maybe the way forward.
Mm.
Kylie, are you happy if I move on, just in the interest of time? Or is that okay? Okay, sorry. There's so many questions here. My apologies to everybody whose question we're not going to get to. We'll save the questions, and I'm going to run a second event, get you all back so we can answer some more. Just before I ask a final question though, Marta has just put a comment into the chat, and just as a public service announcement, I did want to share this. Marta has said, I wanted to say that due to a lack of a platform for science communicators, especially in Australia, but not only, we created STEM Cognito, a STEM communication video platform on which we want to give the voice back to the researchers. Due to a current lack of funding, we can't advertise it, but I wanted to let you know. So if anyone's interested in checking that out further from Marta, it's www.stemcognito.org. So thank you for that, Marta. But Ria has asked the question, which was in fact already on my list of questions that I would really like to finish up with, and we do only have a couple of minutes, but your brief thoughts on this idea we came to before on being human and being vulnerable, and the discomfort that comes from sharing some authenticity, and the exhaustion that comes from that too, as Lyndon pointed out. Is there an extra challenge in doing that as a woman in STEM? So I guess just briefly, do we think there are advantages to being a woman when it comes to science communication? Are there particular disadvantages? And I'm sorry we don't have 3 hours to discuss this, but brief thoughts.
Yeah, I can give you my thoughts. I think in terms of challenges, you definitely, you know, I don't know how well this distributes across men and women, but I definitely find that you do get some quite challenging comments about your communication, and unfortunately, I think it can be quite confronting, because it does show you occasionally out there that there are folks with biases who may not place a lot of value on your expertise, and that can come from a misogynistic place, and that is a bit, it's confronting to come across, and I think you do, as a woman in STEM communicating, you have to prepare yourself for that, and it's, you know, it's unfair, it shouldn't happen, but it does. And so I think there are some demographics and some folks out there who you will not be a good voice for science to. You will not be able to reach those folks for whatever reason, including their own biases. But there are also demographics that you are uniquely well suited to reach, and that's pretty special. So, you know, as a woman, and a woman who's earlier in their career, you know, I feel like I can communicate well to younger women, particularly with vaccine research. That's challenging because younger women, if we're looking at intent to vaccinate, oftentimes women and younger women can be lower down in terms of their intent to vaccinate. And so they can be a more challenging community to reach. And so I do want to, you know, be a very visible person to engage with those sorts of groups. You know, reaching older folks, being accessible, being authentic is important, and it's, you know, it's impactful. And I think as well, just being someone who's visible for the next generation. Some of the nicest experiences I've had have been, you know, friends and folks getting in contact and saying, oh, my son or daughter saw you on the news. That was awesome. They want to be a scientist or whatever. And it's just like, it's the coolest thing ever. And so you come up against people who, sure, they have their biases. They may, and it may come from a misogynistic place, and that's rough. But then you come up against these opportunities to change that for the next generation and change those perceptions. And it's just the coolest privilege. Love it.
Oh, thank you, Kylie. I really hear you. I'm very conscious that I'm sure Linda and Kath also have experiences to share.
Yeah.
But no, Kylie, that wasn't at all wishing that you hadn't said everything that you just said. Every word was valuable. I guess we all have experiences of where we felt like it's a real disadvantage and an advantage. But I guess the reality is that we are all in this game because we're passionate about it and we're doing the best with what we have. And I think you've identified there just the privilege that it is to be someone who does get to communicate about science. So I'm going to seriously think about coming back and bringing this band back for another session at some point, because there's so many things we didn't get to speak about, but I'm looking at the time and knowing I need to let you get back to your very busy days. So my warmest thanks to each of you, Kath and Kylie and Lyndon, for your time and your expertise and your real insight today. I found it incredibly valuable. And I'm just going to hand to the chair of our Women in Science Network, Georgie, just for a moment to end the event. But thank you to everybody for joining us today, and fantastic questions that we didn't get to address. And I'm sorry we didn't get to address more. Georgie, to you.
Hi, Jen. Thanks so much. And I just wanted to end firstly by thanking Jen for organising an amazing seminar. I think we can see what a great job and what an amazing panel she organised by how many people were interested and signed on for today. I think we had about 125 at one point, which is an amazing effort. And that's thanks to all of you lovely ladies who did an amazing job and really gave some great advice. So I want to give a quick plug to our next seminar, which sort of continues on a bit of a theme. So you're talking about being authentic. So our next seminar will be very much on making your mark, now sort of in leadership within our community. And that will be run by Uda Willer. So please join us. That's set for in August. And so we're going to have another really amazing panel to talk about that. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Georgie. Thanks so much, everyone. Go and enjoy some sunshine if you're lucky enough to be in Melbourne on this glorious winter's day. Bye.